Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we're stepping back into the arena. Not the version with dramatic slow motion, perfectly timed music, and a crowd that somehow moves in unison like a well-rehearsed choir. No. Tonight we're looking at the version that actually existed. The one that was louder, stranger, more practical, and in many ways, far more interesting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. There's something oddly comforting about knowing people across the world are listening to the same quiet history at the same time. Now, let's return to the sand. The gates open. Not dramatically. Not all at once. There's no perfect pause for tension. Just the sound of wood, iron, and movement. A gladiator steps forward, and the first thing you notice isn't rage or bloodlust. It's weight. Everything he's wearing is heavy. Not just physically heavy, though yes, very much that. But expensive heavy. Carefully constructed heavy. Maintained, repaired, inspected. This is not a man thrown into an arena with a stick and a vague sense of optimism. This is an investment walking on two legs. Which brings us to the first quiet misconception people tend to carry without even realizing it. Gladiators were not disposable. They couldn't be. Not in the way movies suggest. Because disposable things are cheap. And gladiators were anything but. Training a gladiator took time. Years, sometimes. They lived in training schools, known as ludi, where their days were structured with almost uncomfortable precision. Wake up, train, eat, train again, rest, repeat. Over and over until movement became instinct. And the training itself wasn't random. It wasn't just, fight until you figure it out. It was specialized. Different types of gladiators trained for different roles. One might carry a net and trident, focusing on speed, distance, and timing. Another would be heavily armored, built to absorb hits, to endure, to outlast. These weren't just fighters. They were categories. Archetypes. Designed contrasts. Because contrast creates drama. And drama, more than anything else, is what the arena was built for. Not death. Not really. Death happened, yes. But constant death. That's bad entertainment. It's predictable. And predictable things become boring very quickly. Even in ancient Rome. Imagine attending 10 matches in a row where every single one ends the same way. Fight begins, someone falls, execution follows. By the 5th match, you're not excited. You're checking the position of the sun, wondering how much longer this is going to take. The Romans understood this. They didn't call it audience retention. They didn't have analytics or graphs or engagement curves. But they understood, instinctively, that suspense is more powerful than certainty. And nothing creates suspense quite like the possibility that someone might live. So fights were often structured. Balanced, at least in theory. A slower, heavily armored fighter against a quicker, lightly equipped one. Reach versus defense. Endurance versus agility. Not equal. But interesting. And when one of them fell, that's when the real performance began. The defeated gladiator might raise a finger. Not dramatically. Not slowly. Just enough to signal surrender. A small gesture, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But the crowd was always paying attention. Noise would rise. Not as one voice, but as thousands. Shouting, reacting, arguing. Some demanding mercy. Others calling for death. It wasn't organized. It wasn't coordinated. It was messy. Very Roman. And somewhere in all that noise, a decision had to be made. Not by fate. Not by some fixed rule. By a human being. Usually the sponsor of the games. The person who paid for the event in the first place. Often a politician. Someone with a reputation to maintain and a future to think about. Because the arena wasn't just entertainment. It was politics. Every decision carried weight. Sparing a skilled gladiator might please the crowd. Executing a particularly unpopular one might do the same. But making the wrong call, that could turn the mood very quickly. And moods, in large crowds, are fragile things. Which brings us, slowly, to the gesture everyone thinks they understand. The thumb. You can probably picture it already. The emperor, seated above, watching calmly as the defeated fighter kneels below. A pause. A moment stretched just long enough to feel important. And then, the thumb turns downward. Execution. Except, there's a problem. We don't actually know if that's what happened. Ancient sources mention gestures. They describe decisions. But they're frustratingly vague when it comes to specifics. The phrase often referenced translates loosely to, with a turned thumb. Which is, not very helpful. Turned how? Up. Down. Sideways. Enthusiastically. Slightly. No one thought to clarify. And because no one clarified, later generations filled in the gaps. Artists painted scenes. Writers described moments. Over time, one version became familiar. Familiar became accepted. Accepted became fact. Even if it wasn't. Some historians suggest that an extended thumb might have symbolized a drawn sword. A signal for death. While a closed fist, thumb tucked away, represented mercy. A sheathed blade. Violence withheld. If that's true, then the gesture we all recognize might be completely backwards. Which is, oddly fitting. Because history is full of these small misunderstandings that grow quietly until they feel permanent. And the arena is full of them. Take the idea that every fight was chaotic. That once the gates opened, anything could happen. That it was all just uncontrolled violence. It wasn't. There were rules. Not always fair ones. Not always consistent. But rules nonetheless. Referees watched closely. They stepped in when needed. They enforced boundaries that, from a distance, might not even be visible. Because again, this wasn't random. It was curated. And curated things are managed. Even the injuries, when they happened, were treated with surprising care. Gladiators had access to medical attention. Not modern medicine, obviously, but trained individuals who understood wounds, recovery, and the basic mechanics of keeping someone alive long enough to fight again. Because a returning gladiator is valuable. Familiar faces draw attention. Names get remembered. Stories build over time. A fighter who survives multiple bouts becomes something more than just a participant. They become a figure. And figures attract interest. There are walls in Pompeii, for example, where names of gladiators were scratched into plaster. Not formal inscriptions. Not official records. Just graffiti. Simple messages. Admiration. Support. Sometimes affection. It's easy to forget, looking back, that these were real people with something close to celebrity status. Not in the modern sense, but enough that strangers knew their names. Enough that outcomes mattered beyond the moment. And that only works if they survive. Which brings us, gently, away from the arena, and into a different kind of myth. One that sounds just convincing enough to feel true. The idea of the Roman dinner. Not just a meal, but an event. Reclining on couches, surrounded by excess, eating endlessly while servants move in and out with trays of increasingly elaborate dishes. And somewhere in the background, a quiet understanding that if things become too much, there is always a solution. A room, perhaps. Discreet. Functional. Designed for a very specific purpose. The vomitorium. Except, no. That's not what it was. Not even close. A vomitorium wasn't a dining feature. It wasn't part of a banquet. It had nothing to do with food at all. It was an architectural element. A passageway. A way for large crowds to enter and exit spaces efficiently. The name comes from the idea of people being spewed forth into the streets. Which sounds dramatic, but is actually quite practical when you're dealing with thousands of individuals trying to leave the same place at the same time. No one was excusing themselves mid-meal to visit a designated purging room. At least not as a standard practice. Did some individuals overeat? Of course. Did some regret it? Almost certainly. Humans haven't changed that much. But the idea that Roman culture built this into their architecture as a feature, that's a misunderstanding that stuck simply because it sounds believable. And a little shocking. Which, if we're being honest, is often enough. Because the version of Rome that survives in popular imagination isn't always the most accurate one. It's the most memorable. And memorable things tend to lean toward extremes. But reality is usually somewhere quieter. Less dramatic. More human. And once you start noticing that pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee. Because the more you look at ancient Rome, the more it feels like a place constantly misunderstood, not because people are trying to get it wrong, but because the quieter truth just isn't as immediately dramatic as the myth. Take, for example, the idea that Romans were constantly surrounded by luxury. Marble columns, endless feasts, fountains quietly spilling water into perfectly designed pools while philosophers casually debate the nature of existence in the background. It's a nice image. It's also incomplete. Because most Romans did not live like that. Not even close. The majority lived in apartment buildings called insulae. And if the word apartment makes you think of something comfortable, something stable, something with decent airflow and reliable structure, it might help to gently adjust that expectation. These buildings were crowded. Not charmingly crowded. Not in a lively, social, everyone knows each other sort of way. More like stacked, compressed, constantly at risk of becoming too much for their own foundations to handle. The lower floors were better. More expensive. Closer to the ground, which meant easier access to water, less chance of being trapped if something went wrong. The upper floors were cheaper for a reason. Climbing several flights of narrow stairs every day, carrying whatever you needed, living in spaces that were smaller, hotter, and often less stable. Fires were a real concern. Collapse wasn't unheard of. This wasn't luxury. This was practicality stretched to its limits. And yet, even here, life continued in ways that feel strangely familiar. People worked. They argued. They borrowed things and forgot to return them. They worried about money. They complained about neighbors. They tried, in small ways, to make their spaces feel like something more than just a place to sleep. Because even in a city as large and complex as Rome, daily life still came down to the same quiet details. Food, for instance, wasn't usually a grand affair. For most people, meals were simple. Bread, perhaps some olives, maybe a bit of porridge. Vegetables when available. Meat, if you were fortunate, and even then, not regularly. Cooking at home wasn't always practical, especially in those upper-floor apartments. So many relied on street vendors. Small shops selling prepared food. Something quick, affordable, and filling enough to get you through the day. Not glamorous. But effective. And if you step back for a moment, it starts to shift the picture slightly. Away from endless banquets and towards something more grounded. More ordinary. Which makes the moments of excess stand out even more. Because yes, there were extravagant dinners. Wealthy hosts competing to impress their guests with rare dishes, elaborate presentations. And enough variety to make the entire experience feel less like a meal and more like a performance. But those moments were the exception. Not the rule. And like many exceptions, they became the part people remembered. It's the same with hygiene. There's a persistent idea that Romans were somehow cleaner than everyone else in the ancient world. That their baths, their aqueducts, their systems made them uniquely advanced in ways that feel almost modern. And to be fair, they did build impressive infrastructure. Aqueducts carried water over long distances with remarkable efficiency. Public baths were common, social spaces where people gathered not just to clean themselves, but to talk, to relax, to exist in a shared environment. But clean doesn't always mean what we think it means. Bathing was often communal. The same water used by many people over time. Warm, yes. Comfortable, perhaps. But not exactly sterile. And some practices, when viewed through a modern lens, feel a bit questionable. Take the communal sponge, for example. Used in public latrines. Rinsed, reused, shared. Efficient? Yes. Ideal? That depends entirely on how much you think about it. Which is probably why it's best not to think about it too much. And yet, despite all of this, there's something undeniably impressive about how the system functioned as a whole. Not perfectly. Not hygienically by modern standards. But consistently enough to support a population that, at its peak, was enormous. Rome wasn't just a city. It was a machine. And like any machine, it relied on movement. People moving through streets. Goods arriving from distant regions. Information passing from one place to another, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always in motion. Which brings us, quietly, to another idea that tends to be simplified. The Roman roads. You've probably heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. It sounds poetic. Inevitable. As if every path, no matter where it begins, somehow finds its way back to the center of the world. But the truth is a little more practical. Roman roads were built for efficiency. For control. For movement of armies, yes, but also for trade, communication, administration. They connected regions in ways that made governing a vast territory possible. They weren't symbolic. They were functional. Carefully constructed layers of stone and gravel, designed to last. And many of them did. Some still exist, in one form or another, quietly enduring long after the empire that built them has faded. Which is, in its own way, a kind of legacy. Not dramatic. Not loud. But persistent. And persistence, more than spectacle, is often what defines something truly successful. Of course, not everything about Rome was stable. Far from it. Because for all its systems and structures, Rome was also a place of constant tension. Political, social, economic. Shifting alliances, rising ambitions, quiet resentments building over time. And nowhere is that more visible than in the lives of its leaders. There's a tendency to imagine Roman emperors as either brilliant strategists or completely unhinged figures, teetering somewhere between genius and chaos. And while there are certainly examples that lean heavily in one direction or the other, the reality is often more complicated. Take Nero, for instance. He's often remembered for one very specific image. A city burning in the background while he calmly plays music, indifferent to the destruction around him. It's a powerful image. It's also, likely not true. For one thing, the instrument commonly associated with that story didn't even exist in the form we imagine during his time. For another, accounts suggest he may not have even been in the city when the fire began. And when he did return, there are indications that he organized relief efforts. Opened spaces for those who lost their homes. Tried, in some capacity, to respond. Now, does that make him a misunderstood hero? Not exactly. But it does complicate the story. And that's the thing about Rome. The closer you look, the less simple it becomes. Stories that once felt clear start to blur at the edges. Certainty gives way to interpretation. And what remains is something a little less satisfying, perhaps, but far more real. Because history, when stripped of its neat conclusions, tends to feel unfinished. Like a conversation that never quite reached its end. And maybe that's part of why these myths persist. They give us closure. A clear image. A definitive moment. A thumb turned one way or the other, deciding everything in an instant. But the real version? It lingers. It hesitates. It asks you to sit with the uncertainty for a while. And speaking of uncertainty, there's another belief that tends to slip quietly into conversations about Rome. One that sounds logical at first, almost obvious, until you pause and look at it a little more closely. The idea that Roman soldiers were unstoppable. Perfectly disciplined. Flawlessly trained. Moving as a single, unified force that simply couldn't be broken. And yes, Roman legions were effective. Very effective. But unstoppable is a different thing entirely. And unstoppable is one of those words that sounds impressive, right up until reality quietly disagrees. Because Roman legions, for all their discipline and structure, were still made up of human beings. Tired, hungry, sometimes overconfident human beings, moving through unfamiliar terrain, facing enemies who knew that terrain far better than they did. And occasionally, things went very wrong. There's a tendency to imagine Roman battles as clean, efficient victories. Lines advancing in perfect order, shields locked, formations holding no matter what happens. Strategy overcoming chaos every single time. But battlefields are rarely that cooperative. Mud exists. Weather exists. Fear exists. Communication breaks down. Orders get misunderstood. Units become separated. And once that happens, even the most carefully trained system can start to unravel. One of the clearest examples of this comes from an event known as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. 3 Roman legions, moving through what they believed was friendly territory, were led into a dense forest. Not an open field. Not a place where formations could be easily maintained. But a narrow, uneven environment where visibility was limited and movement was restricted. And then, the attack began. Not all at once. Not in a way that allowed for a clear response. It came in waves. From different directions. Sudden, disorienting, difficult to predict. The Roman system, built for order, found itself in a place defined by disorder. And it struggled. Over the course of several days, those legions were effectively destroyed. Not because they lacked training. Not because they were weak. But because the conditions no longer matched the system they relied on. It's an uncomfortable reminder that even the most powerful structures have limits. And that adaptability, not just strength, often determines survival. Which brings us to another quiet misconception. The idea that Roman expansion was inevitable. That once Rome began to grow, there was no stopping it. That it simply moved outward, steadily, absorbing everything in its path. But expansion isn't just about moving forward. It's about holding what you've already taken. And that is much harder. Every new territory meant more resources required to maintain control. More soldiers needed. More administrators. More systems to keep everything functioning. Distance becomes a factor. Communication slows. Local issues become harder to manage from a central point. And over time, the edges begin to strain. Because an empire isn't just a collection of lands. It's a network. And networks, when stretched too far, become fragile. Rome didn't fall in a single moment. There was no one day where everything simply stopped working. No dramatic scene where someone looks around and says, well, that's the end of that. Instead, it was gradual. Shifts in power. Economic pressure. Internal conflict. External threats. Small changes that, over time, added up to something larger. Which, admittedly, is less cinematic. But far more accurate. And perhaps a little more unsettling. Because gradual change is harder to notice while it's happening. It doesn't announce itself. It just continues. Now, while we're here, there's another image that tends to linger in the background of Roman history. The chariot race. Fast. Dangerous. Crowds roaring as teams compete in tight, controlled chaos around a track designed to push both skill and nerve to their limits. And unlike some of the other myths we've talked about, this one isn't entirely exaggerated. Chariot racing was incredibly popular. Not just as a casual pastime, but as a major event. Organized teams, known as factions, developed strong followings. People had favorites. Allegiances. Preferences that went beyond simple entertainment. It starts to feel surprisingly familiar. Supporters wearing colors. Cheering loudly. Arguing over outcomes. Investing emotional energy into something that, at its core, is a competition between skilled individuals performing for a crowd. The scale, however, was something else entirely. The Circus Maximus, one of the primary venues for these races, could hold an enormous number of spectators. Estimates vary, but even conservative numbers suggest a capacity far beyond what most modern stadiums accommodate. And when those seats were filled, the sound must have been overwhelming. Not polite applause. Not measured reactions. But constant noise. Movement. Energy that builds and sustains itself as the race unfolds. Because unlike gladiator fights, where the outcome might hinge on a single moment, chariot races were continuous. Fast-paced. Less about waiting for a decision and more about reacting to what's happening right now. Crashes were common. Turns were dangerous. And the margin for error was small. Which made victory feel earned. And defeat, immediate. Drivers who survived long enough, who won often enough, could become incredibly famous. Wealthy, even. Their names known across the city. Their successes celebrated in ways that, again, feel oddly modern. It's easy to think of ancient societies as distant, disconnected from the rhythms we recognize today. But then you see something like this. And the distance shrinks a little. Because the core idea, the gathering of people to watch something thrilling, to feel part of a shared moment, that hasn't really changed. Only the details have. And speaking of details, there's one more that tends to slip quietly into discussions about Rome. A smaller one. Less dramatic. But persistent enough to deserve a closer look. The idea that Romans spoke Latin, fluently, universally, exactly as we imagine it now. Which sounds reasonable. After all, Latin was the language of Rome. But languages, like everything else, evolve. The Latin used in formal writing, in official inscriptions, in literature, wasn't always the same as what people spoke in their daily lives. There were variations. Regional differences. Informal shifts in pronunciation and vocabulary that, over time, began to diverge from the standardized version we tend to study. What most people spoke would eventually develop into what we now recognize as the Romance languages. Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, all tracing their roots back to those everyday variations. Which means that if you were to walk through the streets of Rome at its height, listening carefully, what you'd hear wouldn't match perfectly with the Latin you might expect. It would be familiar in structure, perhaps. But different in texture. Less rigid. More fluid. Because living languages rarely stay still. And that, in a way, brings us back to where we started. With the idea that Rome, as we imagine it, is often a collection of simplified images. Clean, defined, easy to understand. But the real version is less certain. More detailed. More inconsistent. Occasionally contradictory. And far more human. Because beneath the myths, beneath the stories that have been shaped and reshaped over time, there were just people. Living their lives. Making decisions. Getting things right sometimes. getting things very wrong at others, and leaving behind just enough evidence for us to piece together something that feels complete, even when it isn't. So the next time you picture ancient Rome, try adjusting the image slightly. Not replacing it entirely. Just softening the edges. Letting a bit of uncertainty in. Because in that uncertainty, there's space for something closer to the truth. And the truth, even when it's quieter, tends to last longer. And the more you allow that uncertainty in, the more Rome starts to feel less like a distant legend and more like a place you could almost step into. Not comfortably, perhaps, but recognizably. Because beyond the arenas and emperors, beyond the marble and mythology, there's a quieter layer that tends to get overlooked. Work. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that ends up carved into stone or written into history books. Just the ordinary, repetitive, necessary kind that keeps everything else functioning. Bakers waking before sunrise to prepare bread for the day. Shopkeepers opening small stalls along busy streets, arranging goods in a way that might catch someone's attention as they pass. Laborers carrying materials from one place to another, over and over again, until the task is done. No audience. No applause. Just routine. And routine, while not particularly exciting to describe, is what most of life actually consists of. Even in a city as grand as Rome. Which makes the moments that break that routine stand out even more. A public announcement. A festival. A sudden shift in mood as news spreads through the streets. Changing the atmosphere in ways that are difficult to measure but easy to feel. Because information in Rome didn't travel instantly. There were no notifications. No messages appearing quietly on a screen. News moved through people. Conversations. Rumors. Official postings read aloud or displayed in public spaces. Which meant that by the time something reached you, it had already passed through several layers of interpretation. Small details changed. Emphasis shifted. Certainty grew or faded depending on who was telling the story. And somewhere along the way, the original version became just one of many. Sound familiar? It should. Because that process hasn't really disappeared. Only the speed has changed. And with that in mind, it becomes easier to understand how certain ideas about Rome took hold. Not because they were entirely accurate, but because they were easy to repeat. Easy to visualize. Easy to remember. Take the image of absolute authority. The emperor, seated above everything, making decisions that no one could question. A single figure controlling the fate of millions with a gesture, a word, a glance. It's a powerful image. But like most powerful images, it simplifies things. Because even emperors operated within systems. They relied on advisors. On administrators. On networks of people who carried out decisions, interpreted orders, managed the day-to-day realities of governing something as vast and complicated as Rome. Power, in practice, is rarely as simple as it appears from a distance. It shifts. It negotiates. It adapts. And sometimes, it hesitates. Even in moments where we expect certainty. Which brings us, quietly, to another commonly held idea. That Roman law was rigid. Unchanging. Applied evenly and consistently across the empire. And while Roman law was indeed influential, structured, and in many ways foundational for later legal systems, it wasn't immune to variation. Context mattered. Status mattered. Who you were could influence how laws applied to you. Citizens, non-citizens, enslaved individuals, elites, each existed within slightly different frameworks. Justice, as a concept, was present. But its application was not always equal. Which again, feels less surprising the more you think about it. Because fairness is an ideal. And ideals, while important, are not always perfectly reflected in reality. Now, shifting slightly, there's a quieter detail about Rome that often goes unnoticed simply because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to focus on. Time. Not in the sense of historical timelines or major events, but in how Romans experienced the passing of a day. Hours weren't fixed the way they are now. Daylight was divided into segments that changed depending on the season. Longer days in summer meant longer hours. Shorter days in winter meant shorter ones. Which means that time itself, stretched and contracted throughout the year. A meeting scheduled for the third hour of the day didn't always occur at the same point relative to sunrise or sunset as it would in another season. It's a small detail. But it changes the rhythm of daily life in subtle ways. Because when time isn't fixed, your sense of it becomes more flexible. More connected to the environment. Less abstract. And then there's the city itself. Not the idealized version with clean lines and open spaces, but the lived-in version. The one filled with noise, movement, and the constant presence of other people. Streets that weren't always easy to navigate. Crowds that formed naturally in busy areas. Animals moving alongside humans. Carts passing through, sometimes slowly, sometimes not. Smells that shifted depending on where you were and what time of day it was. Sounds overlapping. Conversations blending into each other. The occasional shout cutting through the background just long enough to draw attention before fading again. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't orderly in the way we sometimes imagine. It was active. Constantly. And in that constant activity, people found ways to live their lives. To create routines. To build relationships. To carve out small spaces of familiarity within something much larger than themselves. Which brings us, in a slightly unexpected way, to education. Because there's a common assumption that formal learning in ancient Rome was widespread, structured, and accessible in a way that resembles modern systems. But like many things we've talked about, the reality is more uneven. Education depended heavily on status and resources. Some children, particularly from wealthier families, received structured instruction. Reading, writing, rhetoric, philosophy, skills that prepared them for roles in administration, politics, or public life. Others learned through experience. Through work. Through observation and repetition rather than formal teaching. And both forms of learning were valid within their contexts. Because knowledge isn't limited to classrooms. It exists wherever people are trying to understand and navigate the world around them. And as all of this unfolds, daily life, work, movement, conversation, it becomes clear that Rome wasn't defined by a single identity. It wasn't just power. Or luxury. Or violence. It was a combination of all these things, layered together in ways that sometimes made sense and sometimes didn't. Contradictions existed side by side. Sophisticated engineering alongside questionable hygiene practices. Structured governance alongside unpredictable human behavior. Carefully planned events alongside moments of complete chaos. And somehow, it functioned. Not perfectly. But persistently. Which might be the most accurate way to understand it. Not as a flawless system. Not as a constant spectacle. But as something that continued, day after day, adapting, adjusting, occasionally faltering, but never entirely stopping. Until, eventually, it did. But even then, not all at once. Because endings, like everything else in history, tend to be less defined than we expect. They blur. They overlap. They leave behind traces that continue long after the original structure has faded. And Rome, perhaps more than most, left a great many traces. In language. In law. In architecture. In ideas that still echo, quietly, in places far removed from where they began. And as we keep going, the picture becomes a little quieter again. Because after the crowds, after the noise of arenas and races and public life, there's a part of Rome that doesn't announce itself at all. Home. Not the grand villas with painted walls and open courtyards. Those existed, yes, but like so many things we've talked about, they were not the standard experience. Most homes were smaller, simpler, functional in a way that leaves very little room for excess. A single room, perhaps. Maybe two, if circumstances allowed. Shared spaces. Limited privacy. The kind of environment where everyday life isn't something you retreat from, but something you're constantly surrounded by. You hear everything. Conversations through walls. Footsteps above you. Someone moving outside at an hour when you'd rather they didn't. And over time, you get used to it. Because people are adaptable. They find ways to exist comfortably even in spaces that weren't designed with comfort as the primary goal. A small object placed in a familiar spot. A routine repeated enough times that it starts to feel stable. The presence of others becoming less of a disruption and more of a background rhythm. And in that rhythm, life settles. Morning arrives without ceremony. No alarms, no artificial signals to mark the beginning of the day. Just light, gradually making its way into the space. Sounds increasing outside. Movement beginning again. The city wakes up. And with it, so do the people. There's something almost predictable about the sequence. Not rigidly scheduled. But consistent enough that you could close your eyes and still have a sense of what's happening around you. Shops opening. Voices greeting each other in passing. The early exchange of goods, quiet at first, then gradually building as more people enter the streets. And somewhere in all of that, you begin your own day. Not dramatically. Just, steadily. Work, again, takes its place. Because it always does. And while we've already touched on it, there's something worth lingering on here. Not the tasks themselves, but the repetition. The same actions performed over and over. Skills refined not through sudden insight, but through consistency. Through doing something enough times that it becomes second nature. There's a certain kind of quiet mastery in that. The baker who no longer needs to think about measurements. The craftsman who can shape material almost instinctively. The vendor who knows exactly how to speak to a customer in a way that feels natural, unforced. None of it looks extraordinary from the outside. But it is. In a way that doesn't need attention to exist. And then, gradually, the day shifts. Light changes. Shadows lengthen. The intensity of activity softens, just slightly, as people begin to move toward whatever comes next. Food, again, becomes relevant. Not a grand feast. Not an event. Just something to eat. Something to bring the day to a close in a way that feels complete. And once that's done, the city doesn't exactly fall silent. But it quiets. A different kind of noise replaces the earlier one. Less urgency. Fewer voices. Movement that feels slower, more deliberate. And in that quieter space, thoughts have room to settle. It's easy to focus on the dramatic parts of history. The moments that stand out. The events that feel significant enough to be remembered. But most of life, then as now, exists in between those moments. In the pauses. In the routines. In the small, repeated actions that don't make it into records, but make everything else possible. And Rome, for all its scale and complexity, was built on those moments. Not just on victories or decisions or grand constructions. But on days that looked very much like this. Ordinary. Which makes the extraordinary parts feel different. Because they interrupt something. They break the pattern. And when patterns break, people notice. A sudden announcement in the street. A shift in tone that spreads quickly, even before the details are clear. Something has happened. Or is about to happen. And the normal rhythm adjusts. Not instantly. But noticeably. Conversations change direction. Attention shifts. People pause, just long enough to understand whether this is something that matters to them directly, or something they can return to later. Because not every event affects everyone equally. And in a city this large, most things don't. Still, the awareness remains. A background understanding that beyond the routine, beyond the immediate concerns of the day, there are larger forces at work. Decisions being made somewhere else. Outcomes that will eventually ripple outward. Reaching you, perhaps, in ways you can't yet predict. And that awareness, even when it's quiet, shapes behavior. It informs choices. It creates a kind of underlying tension that doesn't always rise to the surface, but is never entirely absent. Because living in a place like Rome meant being part of something larger, whether you wanted to be or not. And yet, despite that scale, individuality persists. People still have preferences. Opinions. Small habits that belong entirely to them. The way they arrange their space. The routes they take through the city. The people they choose to spend time with. These details don't appear in historical summaries. But they are, in many ways, the most real parts of any society. Because they're the parts that don't need to be recorded to exist. And as all of this continues, day after day, moment after moment, it becomes clear that Rome wasn't sustained by constant intensity. It wasn't always at its peak. It wasn't always dramatic. Most of the time, it was simply functioning. Which, when you think about it, might be the most impressive thing of all. Not the grand structures. Not the famous figures. But the ability of something so large, so complex, so full of contradictions, to continue operating. To wake up each day and begin again. And maybe that's why the myths tend to focus on extremes. Because extremes are easier to remember. They stand out. They simplify. But the reality, the steady, continuous reality, requires a different kind of attention. A willingness to sit with something that isn't trying to impress you. That isn't trying to be dramatic. That just is. And in that quiet space. And as we keep moving, something else begins to settle in. Not a fact, exactly. Not a single idea you can point to and hold in place. More like a feeling that builds slowly, almost without you noticing. The sense that Rome, for all its size and influence, was never as solid as it appears from a distance. Because from far away, everything looks stable. Lines are clearer. Structures seem permanent. The noise fades, leaving behind something that feels organized, intentional, almost inevitable. But up close. It's different. Up close, you start to see the adjustments. The small compromises. The constant effort required to keep everything functioning. And nowhere is that more visible than in the edges of the city. Not the center, where attention is focused and maintenance is prioritized, but the places just beyond that. Where systems begin to stretch a little thinner. Where oversight becomes less immediate. Things still work there. But not always as smoothly. Repairs take longer. Problems linger. And people adapt. Because they have to. It's easy to imagine Rome as a finished creation. Something built to perfection and then simply maintained. But that's not how cities work. They grow. They shift. They expand in ways that aren't always planned. New structures added next to old ones. Roads extended, redirected, adjusted to fit changing needs. Spaces repurposed, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. And over time, the result is something layered. Not clean. Not symmetrical. But functional in a way that reflects the people living within it. Which brings us, quietly, to another idea that tends to appear in simplified versions of Roman history. The belief that everything was carefully controlled. That systems operated exactly as intended. That authority flowed clearly from the top down, influencing every part of daily life with precision. But control, in practice, is rarely that complete. Even in highly structured environments. There are always gaps. Moments where things don't quite align with expectations. Situations that require improvisation rather than adherence to a plan. And those moments matter. Because they reveal how flexible a system really is. Whether it can adapt. Or whether it begins to strain under pressure. Consider something as simple as supply. Food, materials, resources, everything that a city depends on to continue functioning. In a place as large as Rome, supply wasn't just important. It was essential. Grain shipments arriving from distant regions. Goods transported along roads and waterways. A constant flow of resources moving toward the center, sustaining a population that could not produce everything it needed locally. And as long as that flow continued, things remained stable. But when it didn't, even briefly, the effects were immediate. Shortages. Rising tension. A shift in mood that spreads quickly, even if the cause isn't immediately visible to everyone. Because people don't need to understand the full system to feel when something is off. They notice the absence. The change. The disruption of what had become expected. And expectation, once established, is a powerful thing. It creates a baseline. A sense of how things should be. And when reality moves away from that baseline, even slightly, it draws attention. Not always dramatically. Sometimes just enough to create a quiet discomfort that lingers in the background. Which, in a way, mirrors something else about Rome that often goes unnoticed. Its dependence on balance. Not a perfect balance. Not something that remained constant. But a general equilibrium between competing forces. Power and responsibility. Expansion and stability. Control and flexibility. When those elements aligned, even loosely, the system held. When they didn't, strain appeared. Not always immediately. Not always visibly. But gradually. And gradual change, as we've seen, is difficult to recognize while it's happening. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear beginning or end. It just unfolds. One decision leading to another. One adjustment creating the need for the next. Until, at some point, the accumulated weight of those changes becomes impossible to ignore. But we're not there yet. Not in this moment. Right now, Rome is still functioning. Still moving. Still waking up each day and continuing in the only way it knows how. And within that continuation, individual lives carry on. Some quietly. Some with a bit more visibility. But all of them contributing, in small ways, to the larger whole. There's a person walking through the city, following a route they've taken so many times it no longer requires conscious thought. A turn here. A pause there. A brief interaction that doesn't seem significant enough to remember, but still shapes the rhythm of the day. Another person, somewhere else, adjusting to a change they didn't expect. A delay. A shortage. A shift in circumstance that requires them to rethink what comes next. These moments don't appear in records. They don't become part of the stories we tell later. But they are happening. Constantly. And when you begin to focus on those moments, the larger picture changes. It becomes less about events, and more about experience. Less about what happened. And more about what it felt like to be there. To live within something that is both stable and uncertain at the same time. To rely on systems that usually work, while knowing, quietly, that they don't always. And that awareness, even when it's subtle, shapes behavior. It creates caution. Adaptability. A tendency to prepare, just slightly, for things not going exactly as expected. Which might explain something else about Rome. Its resilience. Not because it was unbreakable. But because the people within it were used to adjusting. Used to responding to change. Used to continuing, even when conditions weren't ideal. And that ability, to continue, is often what allows something to last longer than expected. Not perfectly. Not without difficulty. But persistently. So as we move forward, slowly, without rushing toward conclusions, it's worth keeping that in mind. That what we're looking at isn't a fixed image. Not a single version of Rome that remains unchanged. But a process. Ongoing. Shifting. Sometimes stable, sometimes strained, but always in motion. And in that motion, there's always something else to notice. Something quieter. Something easy to overlook. But once seen, difficult to forget. And that sense of familiarity, it settles in gently. Not all at once. Not in a way that demands your attention. But slowly, as the details accumulate, as the patterns repeat, as the distance between then and now becomes just a little less absolute. Because once you begin to recognize those rhythms, it's difficult to see Rome as something entirely separate from everything that came after. It starts to feel less like a story, and more like a continuation. There's a tendency, when thinking about the past, to imagine people as fundamentally different. As if living in another time somehow changes the core of what it means to exist day to day. But the closer you look, the more consistent those core experiences appear. Uncertainty. Routine. Moments of calm followed by moments of disruption. Small decisions made without knowing their long-term consequences. All of it, still there. Just arranged differently. And within that arrangement, there's always a sense of movement. Not always forward in a clear, defined way. But movement nonetheless. Adjustments being made. Expectations shifting. Systems responding to pressures that aren't always immediately visible. And sometimes, those pressures build quietly. Without announcement. Without clear markers. Just a gradual increase in strain that becomes noticeable only when it reaches a certain point. It might be economic. Resources becoming harder to manage. Distribution becoming less consistent. Small inefficiencies adding up over time. It might be political. Decisions that once felt stable becoming less certain. Authority being questioned, not always openly, but enough to change how people respond. It might be social. Differences becoming more pronounced. Expectations no longer aligning in the way they once did. None of these shifts happen all at once. And none of them, on their own, define the moment. But together, they begin to shape the direction things are moving in. And still, life continues. Because it always does. People wake up. They follow their routines. They adapt where necessary. They make decisions based on what's in front of them, not always aware of the larger patterns those decisions are contributing to. And in that way, the future is built quietly. Not through a single event. Not through one defining moment. But through accumulation. Which brings us, gently, to the idea of decline. A word that tends to carry a sense of finality. As if it marks a clear turning point. A before and after. But in reality, decline rarely feels like that from the inside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It feels gradual. Ambiguous. Easy to overlook, especially in the beginning. Because for a long time, things still work. Not perfectly. But well enough. And well enough can continue for quite some time. Until it doesn't. And even then, the change isn't always immediate. It unfolds. Adjustments are made. Attempts to restore balance. Efforts to return to what once felt stable. Sometimes those efforts succeed. Temporarily. Sometimes they create new complications. Unintentionally. And through it all, the process continues. Which is why, when looking back, it can be difficult to identify a single moment where everything changed. Because there often isn't one. There are points of pressure. Moments where the strain becomes more visible. Events that accelerate what was already happening. But the underlying process was already in motion. And that's true not just for Rome, but for many systems, many societies, many structures that appear stable from a distance. They don't simply stop. They transition. They transform. They shift into something else. And in Rome's case, that something else didn't erase what came before. It built on it. Adapted it. Carried parts of it forward in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. Which is why traces remain. In language. In ideas. In systems that, even now, reflect patterns established long ago. Not identical. But connected. And that connection is what allows us to look back and see not just what Rome was, but how it continues to influence what came after. Even in subtle ways. A road that still follows an ancient path. A word that carries a meaning shaped centuries ago. A structure built on principles that have been refined but not entirely replaced. These things don't demand attention. But they persist. Quietly. And persistence, as we've seen, is often more significant than spectacle. Because spectacle fades. It relies on attention. On memory. On retelling. But persistence continues whether it's noticed or not. And Rome, in many ways, is defined by that persistence. Not just in what it achieved at its height, but in what remained afterward. Which brings us, slowly, towards something that feels like a conclusion. Even if it isn't quite one. Because this isn't a story with a clear ending. Not in the way we might expect. There's no single moment where everything stops and the scene fades to silence. Instead, there's a gradual shift. A continuation in a different form. A transition that carries forward pieces of what came before. And that, perhaps, is the most accurate way to understand it. Not as something that simply ended. But as something that changed. And continues to change. In ways that are still unfolding. So as we sit here, looking back, trying to understand a civilization that feels both distant and familiar. It's worth remembering that what we're seeing is not a fixed image. It's a process. One that began long before any single moment we've talked about. And continued long after. And in that ongoing process, there's always more to notice. More to understand. More to question. But for now, we let it settle. Not as a finished story. But as something still, quietly continuing. And in that quiet continuation, we find something that feels unexpectedly close. Not because Rome is still here in the form it once was. But because the patterns it followed. The rhythms it moved through. The small, human moments that shaped it. Are not as distant as they might seem. They're still present. Just arranged differently. And once you see that, it's difficult to look at any point in history in quite the same way again. And even as it settles, that thought doesn't quite leave. It lingers. Quietly. Because once you begin to see history as something that continues rather than something that simply ends, it changes the way you look at everything inside it. Moments feel less isolated. Less final. More like part of a longer movement that stretches beyond what we can immediately see. And Rome, perhaps more than most, invites that kind of perspective. Not because it was perfect. Not because it was inevitable. But because it was layered. Built over time, adjusted repeatedly, shaped by countless decisions that didn't feel particularly significant in the moment they were made. There's something almost unsettling about that. The idea that large, lasting structures don't always come from grand, deliberate design alone. But from accumulation. From repetition. From small actions that, over time, create something much larger than themselves. And within that accumulation, there's always variation. Not every day looks the same. Not every experience aligns neatly with the next. Even within a system that appears consistent, there are differences. A quieter street in one part of the city. A busier one in another. A household where things feel relatively stable. Another where uncertainty is more constant. These differences don't define the whole. But they shape how individuals experience it. And that distinction matters. Because when we talk about Rome, we're often talking about it as a single entity. A unified concept. Something that can be described in broad terms. But no one actually lived in Rome as an abstract idea. They lived in specific places. At specific times. Under specific conditions that didn't always match the larger narrative. And so their experiences, while connected, were not identical. Which means that any attempt to fully understand Rome requires a certain level of acceptance. That there isn't one version. Not one definitive perspective that captures everything. Only fragments. Collected. Interpreted. Arranged in ways that make sense to us now. And even then, something remains just out of reach. Not because it's hidden. But because it was never recorded in the first place. The tone of a voice. The pause in a conversation. The exact feeling of standing in a crowded street at a particular moment in time. These details don't survive. At least not directly. But they leave traces. Indirectly. In the patterns we can still observe. In the structures that remain. In the behaviors that echo across time. And if you pay attention to those traces, if you allow them to guide your understanding rather than forcing a clear, simplified image, something interesting begins to happen. Rome starts to feel less like a subject being studied. And more like an environment being experienced. Not fully. Not perfectly. But enough to sense its rhythm. Its pace. Its inconsistencies. And in that sense, history becomes less about memorizing what happened. And more about understanding how things unfolded. Which is a quieter kind of knowledge. Less immediate. But often more lasting. Because facts can be repeated. Dates can be remembered. But patterns, once recognized, tend to stay with you. They change the way you interpret new information. They provide context where there was none before. They allow you to see connections that might otherwise go unnoticed. And Rome, with all its layers, all its contradictions, all its persistence, offers a particularly clear set of patterns to observe. Not because it is unique, but because it is well documented. Well preserved in fragments that, when placed together, form something close to a continuous thread. A thread that doesn't run straight. That loops, overlaps, occasionally doubles back on itself. But continues. And as long as it continues, there is always something else to follow. Another detail. Another shift. Another moment that, on its own, might not seem significant. But becomes meaningful when placed within the larger flow. Which brings us, gently, to something that often sits just beneath the surface of historical discussion. Perspective. Not just what we know, but how we choose to interpret it. Because every story about Rome, every explanation, every attempt to describe what it was, is shaped by the viewpoint of the person telling it. What they focus on. What they consider important. What they choose to leave out. And those choices, even when made carefully, create a version of Rome that reflects not just the past, but the present as well. The questions we ask. The comparisons we make. The assumptions we bring with us when we begin to look. All of these influence what we see. Which means that understanding Rome isn't just about looking backward. It's also about recognizing the lens through which we're looking. And once you become aware of that lens, once you notice how it shapes the image, you gain a different kind of clarity. Not certainty, but awareness. The understanding that what you're seeing is part of the picture, not the entire thing. And that there is always more beyond it. More context. More nuance. More complexity waiting just outside the frame. Which, in a way, brings us full circle. Back to where we began. With the idea that Rome, as commonly imagined, is often simpler than it actually was. And that simplicity, while useful, can only take you so far. Beyond it, there's something quieter, less defined, but far more reflective of reality. A Rome that isn't just a collection of myths to be corrected, but a system to be understood. Not all at once. Not completely. But gradually. Through observation. Through patience. Through a willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than immediately resolving it. And in that process, the distance between then and now continues to narrow. Not because the differences disappear, but because the similarities become easier to see. And once they do, history stops feeling like something separate. It becomes something connected. Something ongoing. Something that, in small, subtle ways, we are still part of. And with that, the city does not pause for reflection. It does not slow down just because someone, somewhere, has begun to understand it a little more clearly. Rome continues in the only way it ever has, by moving forward through ordinary moments that, when taken together, form something much larger than themselves. Morning becomes afternoon without ceremony. The light shifts gradually, almost unnoticed, unless you are looking for it. Shadows stretch across stone, across walls, across the uneven surfaces of streets that have carried thousands of footsteps long before this moment and will carry thousands more after. There is a rhythm here. Not imposed, not controlled in any strict sense, but present. Reliable enough that people build their lives around it without needing to think about it too deeply. A shop opens at roughly the same time each day. Not because a clock demands it, but because experience has shown that this is when people begin to pass by. A vendor prepares food in a way that feels automatic now, hands moving with a familiarity that comes only from repetition. Customers arrive, not all at once, but steadily, each interaction blending into the next until the distinction between them fades. Nothing about this feels historic in the moment. No one pauses to consider that this exact sequence, this exchange of goods, this brief conversation, is part of something that will one day be studied, interpreted, explained. It is simply happening. And that, perhaps, is the most important detail to hold on to. Because history, when it is being lived, does not feel like history. It feels like the present. Uncertain. Immediate. Ordinary. And full of small decisions that don't yet carry the weight they will eventually be given. A person chooses one path through the city instead of another. Not for any significant reason. Perhaps it is shorter. Perhaps it is familiar. Perhaps it simply feels easier. Another person delays a task. Just briefly. Just long enough that it changes what comes next in a way that cannot be predicted. These are not events. They are moments. But moments, repeated across thousands of lives, begin to form patterns. And patterns, over time, shape outcomes. This is how cities function. Not through a single, guiding force that directs every movement, but through the accumulation of countless individual actions that align just enough to keep everything moving. Rome is no different. It appears controlled from a distance. Structured. Organized. Intentional. But up close, it is flexible. Responsive. Occasionally inconsistent. And entirely dependent on the people who move through it each day. There is a sound that belongs to the city. Not one specific noise, but a layered combination of many. Voices overlapping. Footsteps echoing against stone. The distant movement of carts. The occasional sharp interruption of something unexpected cutting through the background. It is not constant. But it is persistent. And over time, it becomes familiar. So familiar that its absence would feel more noticeable than its presence. Silence, when it appears, is temporary. A pause rather than a state. Because Rome, like any place built on continuous activity, does not remain still for long. Even at night, when movement slows and the intensity of the day fades, there is still something happening. A quieter version of the same rhythm. Fewer voices, softer sounds, but not complete stillness. And then, without any clear boundary, the cycle begins again. Morning returns. Light spreads. The city wakes. And everything continues. This repetition is easy to overlook. It does not stand out. It does not demand attention. But it is the foundation of everything else. Without it, the larger moments, the events, the decisions, the shifts in direction, would have nothing to rest on. They would have no context. No continuity. And continuity is what allows something to last. Rome lasted not because it was constantly extraordinary, but because it was consistently functional. Even when conditions were not ideal. Even when pressures began to build. Even when the systems that supported it showed signs of strain. It continued. Not perfectly. But persistently. And persistence, as we have seen, is often more important than perfection. Because perfection is difficult to maintain. It requires constant attention. Constant correction. And even then, it rarely lasts. Persistence, on the other hand, allows for variation. For imperfection. For adjustment. It does not demand that everything be exactly right. Only that it continues to work well enough. And well enough is a powerful threshold. It allows systems to absorb small disruptions without collapsing. It provides space for recovery. For adaptation. For change that does not immediately break what already exists. Rome operated within that threshold for a long time. Long enough to create the impression of stability. Long enough that, from a distance, it appears almost unshakable. But as we have already begun to notice, that stability was not fixed. It was maintained. And maintenance, by its nature, is ongoing. It requires effort. Attention. Resources. And when any of those elements become inconsistent, the effects begin to appear. Not always dramatically. Sometimes so gradually that they are difficult to recognize in the moment. A delay that becomes slightly more common. A repair that takes a little longer than expected. A process that once felt reliable becoming just uncertain enough to notice. Individually, these changes are small. Easily dismissed. But together, they begin to shift the overall experience. They alter expectations. They introduce a level of unpredictability that wasn't there before. And once unpredictability becomes part of the system, even in small ways, behavior changes. People adapt. They prepare differently. They make choices with slightly more caution. Not necessarily because they understand the full scope of what is changing, but because they can feel that something is not quite the same as it was. And that feeling, even when it is subtle, matters. It influences decisions. It shapes interactions. It contributes to the larger pattern in ways that are not always immediately visible. This is how change happens in complex systems. Not all at once. Not in a single, defining moment. But gradually. Through accumulation. Through adjustment. Through countless small shifts that, over time, lead to something larger. And all the while, life continues. People wake up. They go about their day. They respond to what is in front of them. They do not pause to analyze the system they are part of. They simply live within it. Which is why, from the inside, change often feels less dramatic than it appears from the outside. Because it is experienced in fragments. In isolated moments that do not yet form a complete picture. Only later, when those moments are connected, does the larger pattern become clear. And by then, the process is already well underway. Rome, at this point, is still within that process. Still functioning. Still adapting. Still continuing in ways that feel familiar to those living within it. But the patterns are there. The small shifts. The subtle changes. The gradual movement away from what once felt stable. Not enough to define the moment. Not enough to signal an immediate turning point. But enough to suggest that the future will not look exactly like the past. And that realization, even when it is not fully conscious, begins to shape what comes next. Because once a system starts to change, even slightly, it rarely returns to its previous state unchanged. It moves forward. Into something new. Something that carries elements of what came before, but is not identical to it. And that forward movement, slow as it may be, is constant. It does not stop. It does not reverse entirely. It continues. Just as Rome continues now. Through ordinary days. Through quiet moments. Through the steady rhythm of life that does not need to be extraordinary to matter. And as long as that rhythm remains, there is always more to see. More to understand. More to notice in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually was. And so, without rushing, without forcing a conclusion, we stay within that rhythm. We observe. We follow. We allow the details to build naturally, without simplifying them too quickly. Because in those details, in that steady, continuous flow, Rome reveals itself not as a single story, but as something ongoing. Something layered. Something that does not end, but changes. And continues. Not in a dramatic way. Not with any clear signal that something important has just happened. Just the quiet, steady continuation of a system that has learned, over time, how to keep moving even when the conditions around it are less than ideal. Because by now, that is something Rome understands well. How to continue. How to adjust without stopping. How to absorb change without immediately breaking. And yet, even within that ability, there is a limit. Not a fixed point. Not something clearly marked. But a threshold that exists whether anyone is aware of it or not. A point where adaptation becomes more difficult. Where adjustments no longer restore balance as easily as they once did. Where effort increases, but results become less predictable. And again, this is not something that announces itself. It does not arrive with clarity. It builds quietly. Through repetition. Through strain that accumulates just slowly enough to remain manageable, until it isn't. But for now, we remain in the middle of that process. In a Rome that is still functioning, still active, still full of movement and routine and the countless small interactions that define daily life. There is a person standing in a crowded space, waiting. Not impatiently. Not urgently. Just waiting for something to resolve. A transaction. A conversation. A moment that needs to complete itself before the next one can begin. And in that waiting, there is time. Time to observe. To notice the way people move around each other. The unspoken coordination that allows a large number of individuals to share the same space without constant conflict. It is not perfect. There are interruptions. Small collisions. Moments where paths cross in ways that require adjustment. But overall, it works. Not because it is designed perfectly. But because people adapt to it. They anticipate. They adjust their pace. They shift slightly to the side without needing to think about it too deeply. These are learned behaviors. Developed over time. refined through repetition. And they allow the system to function more smoothly than it otherwise would. This is true not just in movement, but in interaction. In communication. In the countless exchanges that happen throughout the day. A question asked. An answer given. An agreement reached. Or not reached. And even when things do not align perfectly, there is usually a way forward. A compromise. A delay. An adjustment that allows the process to continue. This flexibility is part of what sustains Rome. Not rigid perfection. But the ability to bend without immediately breaking. And yet, as with everything else, that flexibility depends on conditions. On the availability of resources. On the reliability of systems. On the general expectation that things will continue to function as they have before. When those expectations are met, the system feels stable. When they begin to shift, even slightly, the experience changes. It becomes less predictable. Less certain. And certainty, even in small amounts, is something people rely on more than they often realize. It shapes behavior. It informs decisions. It provides a sense of structure that makes daily life easier to navigate. Without it, everything requires a little more attention. A little more effort. A little more caution. And over time, that added effort begins to matter. Not all at once. But gradually. As it accumulates. As it becomes part of the routine rather than an exception to it. This is how strain becomes embedded in a system, not through a single overwhelming force, but through many small pressures that, together, create something more difficult to manage. Rome, at this stage, is beginning to feel some of that pressure. Not everywhere. Not equally. But enough that it exists. In certain areas. In certain systems. In ways that are noticeable if you know what to look for, but easy to overlook if you don't. And most people, understandably, are not looking for it. They are focused on their own lives. Their own routines. Their own immediate concerns. Because that is what matters most in the moment. The larger system exists. It influences. It shapes. But it is not always the primary focus of daily thought. And so, life continues. People adapt. They find ways to work within the changing conditions. They adjust expectations slightly. They make decisions based on what feels reliable now, rather than what was reliable before. And in doing so, they become part of the process. Part of the gradual shift that is taking place. Even if they do not recognize it as such. This is the quiet complexity of Rome. Not just in its structures or its systems, but in the way those systems interact with the people who live within them. A constant exchange. A feedback loop where individual behavior shapes the system, and the system, in turn, shapes individual behavior. Neither entirely in control. Both influencing the outcome. And within that interaction, there is always movement. Always change. Even when it feels like things are staying the same. Because stability, as we've seen, is not the absence of change. It is the management of it. The ability to absorb it without losing function. And when that ability begins to weaken, even slightly, the nature of the system begins to shift. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But inevitably. And still, through all of this, Rome continues. It wakes that it moves. It functions. It carries on through the ordinary flow of days that, taken individually, do not seem particularly significant. But collectively, define everything. This is where we remain. Not at the beginning. Not at the end. But in the middle. Where most of life happens. Where most of history unfolds. Not in the moments that stand out. But in the ones that blend together. And as we stay here, observing, following, allowing the details to build without forcing them into a simplified narrative, we begin to see something more complete. Not a perfect picture. Not a final answer. But a deeper understanding. One that accepts complexity. That allows for uncertainty. That recognizes that what we are looking at is not a fixed story, but an ongoing process. And in that process, there is always more. More to notice. More to understand. More to follow as the rhythm continues. Steady. Persistent. Unchanged in its continuation. Even as everything within it slowly, quietly changes. Even as everything within it slowly, quietly changes. The shift is not obvious at first. It doesn't interrupt the rhythm in a way that forces immediate attention. The same streets are still there. The same routes, the same routines, the same exchanges repeating day after day. And yet, something feels just slightly different. Not wrong. Not broken. Just altered. A familiar place that no longer feels exactly the same as it did before. You can't point to a single reason. There isn't one clear cause. But the feeling is there, subtle and persistent, like a detail just at the edge of your awareness. And once you notice it, you begin to look for it. In small things. In the way conversations unfold. In the way people respond to delays, to changes, to uncertainty. In the way expectations adjust, almost automatically, to match what is becoming normal. Because what is normal is not fixed. It shifts. Quietly. Gradually. Until one day, what once felt unusual becomes expected. And what was once expected becomes something you remember, rather than something you experience. This is how transitions take hold. Not through sudden transformation, but through redefinition. A slow replacement of one pattern with another. One assumption with a slightly different one. And as this happens, the rhythm continues. Because rhythm does not depend on consistency in detail. It depends on continuity. On the fact that something follows something else in a way that feels predictable enough to rely on. And Rome, even now, still has that. Still wakes. Still moves. Still functions. But the underlying patterns are shifting. The balance is adjusting. The system is adapting, not just to maintain itself, but because it has no other option. Because change, once it begins, cannot simply be undone. It can be managed. Redirected. Slowed, perhaps. But not entirely reversed. And so the process continues. There is a moment, somewhere in the city, where someone makes a decision that feels small. A practical choice. A response to current conditions. It makes sense at the time. It solves an immediate problem. And because it works, it is repeated. Not consciously, not as part of a larger plan, but because it is effective. And repetition creates patterns. Patterns that spread. That influence others. That become part of the system itself. This is how change embeds itself. Not through instruction. But through behavior. Through actions that, once proven useful, become part of routine. And routine is powerful. Because it does not require constant thought. It operates in the background. Shaping outcomes without needing to be questioned every time. And as routines shift, even slightly, the system begins to change with them. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But steadily. And that steady change, over time, becomes something significant, something that, when viewed from a distance, appears as a turning point. But from within, felt like a series of ordinary days. This is the perspective that is easy to lose. The inside view. Where nothing feels like a major event. Where life continues in ways that feel familiar, even as the conditions slowly evolve. And this is where Rome exists now. Not in a moment of collapse. Not in a moment of clear transformation. But in the space between. Where change is happening, but has not yet fully revealed its consequences. Where the future is being shaped, but not yet understood. And in that space, there is uncertainty. Not overwhelming. Not constant. But present. A quiet awareness that things are not exactly as they were. That adjustments are being made more often. That outcomes are slightly less predictable. And yet, life continues. Because it must. Because stopping is not an option. Because the system, for all its complexity, is still functional enough to carry on. And so it does. Through routine. Through adaptation. Through the countless small actions that sustain it from one moment to the next. And within that continuation, there is a kind of resilience. Not the kind that resists change entirely. But the kind that absorbs it. That bends without immediately breaking. That allows the system to continue even as it transforms. This is not stability in the traditional sense. It is dynamic. Fluid. Always adjusting. Always responding. And because of that, it lasts. Longer than it might otherwise. Long enough to create the impression that it will always continue. That the rhythm will never stop. That the system, however imperfect, is permanent. But permanence is often an illusion. A result of duration rather than certainty. Something that feels unchanging simply because it has not yet changed in a way that is impossible to ignore. And Rome, for a long time, existed within that illusion. Not because it was unaware of its own challenges. But because it had always found ways to continue despite them. Which creates confidence. A sense that whatever happens, it can be managed. Adjusted. Overcome. And that confidence, while not entirely misplaced, can sometimes obscure the limits that exist beneath it. Limits that are not immediately visible. But are always present. And when those limits are reached, the nature of the system begins to change in ways that cannot be easily reversed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But undeniably. And still, we remain here. In the middle of it. Watching. Following. Allowing the process to unfold without rushing ahead to conclusions. Because understanding this moment, this gradual shift, requires patience. It requires attention to detail. To small changes that might otherwise be dismissed. To patterns that take time to become visible. And as we continue to observe, to follow the rhythm as it carries forward, we begin to see more clearly. Not everything. Not perfectly. But enough to recognize that what we are witnessing is not a single event. But a transition. Ongoing. Unfolding. Still incomplete. And in that incompleteness, there is still more to come. More movement. More change. More quiet adjustments that will shape what happens next. And so we continue. Steadily. Without interruption. Following the rhythm as it moves forward. Unchanged in its persistence. Even as everything within it continues to change. Even as everything within it continues to change. The movement forward is almost unnoticeable if you focus only on a single moment. A single day still feels like any other. The same sounds, the same routines, the same patterns repeating in ways that feel dependable. But if you widen your view, just slightly, the differences begin to gather. Not in a way that demands attention. But in a way that invites it. A familiar process takes a little longer than it used to. Not enough to cause immediate concern, but enough to be noticed if you are paying close attention. A conversation carries a slightly different tone. A hesitation where there once was certainty. A question asked where previously there would have been none. These are not disruptions. They are adjustments. Small recalibrations in response to conditions that are shifting beneath the surface. And as these adjustments repeat, they begin to form a new pattern. One that exists alongside the old for a time. Not replacing it immediately. but gradually becoming more common, more familiar, more expected. This overlap between what was and what is becoming creates a kind of tension. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but present. A quiet sense that two versions of the same system are existing at once. One based on past expectations, the other forming in response to current realities. And navigating between those two versions requires effort. Not always conscious effort, but effort nonetheless. People adapt. They learn what still works, what no longer does. They adjust their behavior accordingly. Not because they have a full understanding of the larger system, but because they are responding to what they experience directly. And in doing so, they help shape the direction of change. This is how systems evolve from within. Not through a single directive. Not through a clear, centralized decision. But through the accumulation of individual responses to shifting conditions. Each adjustment small. Each one logical in isolation. But together, creating something new. Something that did not exist before. And still, the rhythm continues. Because rhythm does not depend on sameness. It depends on continuity. On the ongoing sequence of moments that connect one to the next. Rome still has that. It still wakes. It still moves. It still functions. But the nature of that function is changing. Subtly. Gradually. In ways that are easy to overlook if you are not looking for them. And most people are not. They are focused on their own immediate concerns. Their own routines. Their own lives. Because that is what matters most in the moment. The larger system, while always present, remains in the background. Influencing. Shaping. But not always demanding attention. And so the process continues. Quietly. Steadily. Without interruption. Until, at some point, the accumulation of change becomes visible in a way that cannot be ignored. Not as a single event. But as a realization. A moment where the difference between what was and what is, becomes clear. Not because something dramatic has happened. But because enough small changes have added up to create something that feels distinctly different. And that realization, when it comes, is often unexpected. Not because the change wasn't happening. But because it was happening gradually. Without drawing attention to itself. And by the time it is fully recognized, it has already been in motion for a long time. Rome is moving toward that realization. Not there yet. But approaching. Through the steady accumulation of adjustments. Through the quiet shift in expectations. Through the ongoing process of adaptation that continues even as the system itself begins to transform. And within that process, there is a kind of momentum. Not fast. Not dramatic. But persistent. A forward movement that does not require intention to continue. Because it is built into the structure of the system itself. Once change begins, it creates conditions that lead to further change. New patterns create new expectations. New expectations lead to new behaviors. New behaviors reinforce the patterns that created them. And the cycle continues. Self-sustaining. Expanding. Until it reaches a point where the system that once existed, is no longer quite the same. Not gone. Not erased. But altered. In ways that cannot be undone simply by returning to previous conditions. Because those conditions no longer exist. They have been replaced. Gradually. By something else. And still, from within, life continues. People wake up. They go about their day. They adapt to what is in front of them. They make decisions based on what feels real and immediate. Not on what once was, because the past, while still present in memory, no longer defines the current experience in the same way. And this is how transition completes itself. Not through a clear ending. but through a shift in perspective. A point where what once felt like change, now feels like normal. Where the new pattern is no longer recognized as new, but simply as the way things are. And when that happens, the transition, in a practical sense, is complete. Even if it is never formally acknowledged. Even if there is no moment that marks its conclusion. Because not all changes announce themselves. Some simply settle. Quietly. Until they become part of the background. Part of the rhythm. Part of the ongoing flow that continues without needing to be defined. And Rome, as we continue to observe it, is moving through that process. Not as a single story. Not as a fixed point in time. But as an unfolding sequence of moments that, together, create something far more complex than any simplified version could capture. And so we remain within that sequence. Following it. Allowing it to reveal itself at its own pace. Without rushing ahead. Without forcing clarity where there is still uncertainty. Because understanding, in this case, does not come from reaching the end. It comes from paying attention to the process. To the rhythm. To the small details that, when seen together, form something larger. Something continuous. Something that does not stop. At this point, the change is no longer something that exists only at the edges. It is still quiet, still subtle, but it has moved closer to the center of experience. Not enough to disrupt everything, not enough to stop the rhythm, but enough to be felt more often. More frequently. More consistently. There are moments now where something that once worked without effort requires a second attempt. A pause. A reconsideration. Not a failure. Just a slight interruption in what used to be automatic. And those interruptions, small as they are, begin to shape perception. Because when something that was once reliable becomes just slightly uncertain, attention shifts. People notice. Not in a dramatic way. But in the way you notice when a familiar path has changed just enough that you need to think about it again. A turn that feels different. A step that requires more awareness than it used to. And once that awareness is there, it doesn't fully disappear. Even when things return to something close to normal, the memory of that uncertainty remains. A quiet reminder that what feels stable, may not always be. And that reminder influences behavior. Subtly. Persistently. People begin to prepare in small ways. They allow for delays. They adjust expectations. They build in flexibility where before there was none. And flexibility, while useful, also changes the structure of routine. It makes things less rigid. Less predictable. More dependent on conditions that can shift. And as this becomes more common, the overall rhythm changes. Not in speed. But in texture. It feels different. Less smooth. Less certain. But still functional. Still continuing. Because continuity does not require perfection. Only persistence. And Rome, even now, still has that persistence. Still moves forward through the accumulation of days that feel, on the surface, much like the ones that came before. But beneath that surface, the structure is shifting. Gradually aligning with new conditions. New patterns. New expectations that are forming in response to what is happening now, rather than what once was. There is a moment, somewhere in the city, where someone makes a decision differently than they would have before. Not because they are consciously responding to a larger change. But because their experience has taught them that the old way no longer works as reliably. So they adjust. Slightly. And that adjustment works. It solves the immediate problem. It becomes a new approach. And once it is repeated, it becomes part of routine. This is how transformation happens. Not through sudden replacement. But through gradual substitution. One behavior replacing another. One expectation shifting into a new form. Until the original pattern is no longer dominant. Not gone. but no longer central. And this process, once it reaches a certain point, becomes self-reinforcing. Because the new patterns create conditions that support themselves. They generate outcomes that make them seem natural. Inevitable, even. And once something feels inevitable, it is rarely questioned. It is accepted. Integrated. Becomes part of the system in a way that no longer feels like change. But simply like reality. Rome is moving closer to that point. Not fully there. But approaching. Through the steady accumulation of these small shifts. Through the quiet redefinition of what is expected. Of what is normal. Of what people rely on when they move through their daily lives. And yet, even as this happens, the larger structure still stands. The city is still there. The systems still function. The routines still repeat. From a distance, it still looks the same. Still feels familiar. Still carries the weight of everything it has been. But up close, the experience is different. Not dramatically. But meaningfully. And that difference continues to grow. Not quickly. Not in a way that demands immediate recognition. But steadily. Persistently. As each small change builds on the last. As each adjustment contributes to a larger pattern that is still forming. Still unfolding. Still moving forward without a clear endpoint. And that is where we remain. Within the process. Not at its conclusion. Not at its beginning. But in the middle. Where everything is still in motion. Where outcomes are not yet fully defined. Where the future is being shaped, one moment at a time. And as long as that motion continues, there is no final state. Only transition. Only change. Only the ongoing rhythm that carries everything forward. And so we follow it. Without interruption. Without forcing resolution. Allowing it to continue at its own pace. To reveal what comes next, not all at once. But gradually. Through the same steady progression that has brought us here. And in that progression, we begin to understand something that is easy to miss. That Rome was never a single moment. Never a fixed identity. But a continuous process. One that adapted. Shifted. Evolved over time. And in doing so, became something more complex than any single version could capture. Something that cannot be reduced to a simple story. Because it never stopped changing. And even now, in the way we remember it, in the way we interpret it. That change continues. Quietly. Persistently. At least, not in the way endings are usually imagined. Because by now, the idea of a clear conclusion feels less convincing. Less necessary. What we are following isn't moving toward a single moment where everything stops. It's moving through a sequence of changes that reshape what already exists into something else. Something that still carries traces of what came before. Something that still feels, in certain ways, familiar. But is no longer the same. And this is where the distinction becomes important. Between disappearance and transformation. Rome does not simply vanish. It becomes something different. Something that emerges gradually, through the same process we've been observing all along. Adjustment. Adaptation. Accumulation. There is no sudden silence. No moment where the city empties and everything falls still. Instead, there is continuation. But the continuation feels different now. More uneven. Less certain. The rhythm is still there, but it no longer flows as smoothly as it once did. There are more interruptions. More inconsistencies. More moments where the system does not respond as expected. And those moments, once rare, are becoming more common. Not enough to define every experience. But enough to be noticed. Enough to influence behavior. Enough to shape expectations in ways that gradually alter how people move through their daily lives. Because when uncertainty becomes part of the pattern, even in small ways, it changes how that pattern is experienced. It introduces hesitation, caution, a tendency to anticipate problems that may or may not occur. And anticipation, even when it is subtle, affects decisions. People prepare differently. They adapt their routines. They build in space for things not going exactly as planned. And in doing so, they change the system itself. Because systems are not separate from the people within them. They are created by those people. Maintained by them. And ultimately, transformed by them. This is the stage where Rome now exists. Not stable in the way it once was. But not collapsed. Not broken. Still functioning. Still continuing. But with a growing sense that the conditions supporting that continuation are shifting. And that shift is no longer confined to the edges. It is present in the center. In the everyday experience. In the small details that, taken together, define what it feels like to live within the system. There is a moment where someone expects something to happen in a certain way, and it doesn't. Not dramatically. Not as a failure. Just differently. And that difference, small as it is, requires adjustment. A new approach. A reconsideration. And once that adjustment is made, it becomes part of experience. Something to remember. Something to factor into future decisions. And as these moments accumulate, they begin to reshape understanding. Not all at once. But gradually. Until the way people interpret the world around them is no longer based on what once worked, but on what works now. And that shift in perspective is significant. Because it marks the point where change is no longer external. No longer something happening to the system. But something that has been integrated into it. Something that defines it. And once that happens, the process accelerates. Not necessarily in speed, but in effect. Because each new change builds on a system that is already adapting. Already shifting. Already different from what it was before. And this creates momentum. A forward movement that is difficult to slow. Difficult to reverse. Because it is not driven by a single force. But by the combined effect of countless small adjustments happening at the same time. This is where transformation becomes undeniable. Not because of a single event. But because the accumulation of change reaches a point where it can no longer be interpreted as temporary. It becomes the new structure. The new pattern. The new normal. And at that point, the question is no longer whether things have changed. But how that change will continue. Because once a system enters this phase, it does not return to its previous state. It moves forward. Into something else. Something that carries elements of what came before, but is shaped by the conditions of the present. And this is where Rome begins to feel less like what it was, and more like what it is becoming. Still recognizable. Still connected to its past. But no longer defined by it in the same way. The identity shifts. Not completely. Not instantly. But enough that the difference is real. Enough that it affects how the system functions. How people interact with it. How it continues. And through all of this, life goes on. Because it always does. People wake up. They move through their day. They adapt to the conditions in front of them. They make decisions based on what feels real and immediate. Not on abstract ideas of change or transformation. But on practical needs. Immediate concerns. And in doing so, they continue to shape the system. To contribute to its evolution. Without necessarily seeing the full picture of what that evolution is becoming. And that is perhaps the most important detail of all. That from the inside, this does not feel like the end of something. It feels like continuation. Like adaptation. like life moving forward in response to changing conditions. And that perspective is what makes it possible for the process to unfold without interruption, without collapse, without a clear break. Because systems do not need to recognize their own transformation in order for it to occur. They only need to continue. And Rome continues. Not as it once was, but as something in motion. Something changing. Something becoming. And in that becoming, there is no final point. No fixed destination. Only the ongoing rhythm. Carrying everything forward. And what comes next does not arrive as something entirely unfamiliar. It doesn't replace everything all at once or erase what came before in a single motion. Instead, it emerges from within the existing structure, shaped by it, influenced by it, and in many ways, dependent on it. Because even as Rome changes, it carries itself forward. Not as a perfect copy. Not as something unchanged. But as something that remembers. In its systems. In its habits. In the ways people continue to think, to act, to organize their lives even as conditions shift around them. There is continuity here. Not in detail. But in pattern. And patterns are resilient. They adapt. They stretch. They adjust to new circumstances without losing their core function entirely. Which is why, even as the structure begins to feel different, even as the experience of living within it changes, there are still moments that feel familiar. Moments where the rhythm aligns just enough with what came before to create a sense of recognition. A reminder that this is not something entirely new, but something evolving. And evolution is not always obvious while it is happening. It reveals itself gradually. Through comparison. Through memory. Through the quiet realization that what once felt constant, is no longer quite the same. There is a person, somewhere in the city, who notices this. Not in a grand, analytical way. Not as a conclusion. But as a feeling.